I've just disembarked a cruise on a battery-powered ship that visited 21 different ports in 4 days. The journey took us from Tromso in the Arctic Circle all the way down to Bergen, and I took this cruise in the middle of winter. I saw and did things on this trip that have to be seen to be believed, from the ports that we visited to the surprisingly luxurious ship and the food. I will show you it all. Usually when you embark at cruise, it'll be lunchtime, maybe early afternoon. Our embarkation time was 11:45 p.m. I had a friend on board who'd already been on the ship for around a week at this point, and he had been sending me the most terrifying weather reports and footage of the ship travelling through really rough seas and storms to come and pick me up. I was excited, but definitely a little bit nervous about getting on board. I do get seasick, and I don't claim to know much about Norwegian weather, but a high avalanche danger warning definitely didn't seem good. The ship that we were boarding was called the Havila Polaris, and we walked through a deserted terminal and just straight up the gangway to board. This felt like breaking every single cruise ship rule all at once. Normally you have to check in at the terminal, you go through security, they scan your bags, it takes a while, but we literally just walked up the walkway and we were in the middle of the ship. We checked in at reception the same way you would in a hotel on land, and we were ready to start our cruise in 5 minutes, which was really exciting. Some guests had already been on board for a week at this point, and some would only be on the ship for a couple of hours between ports. How they keep track of everybody coming and going, I would never know, but I did wonder if this would affect our cruise. I didn't know if it would really feel like a cruise at all. I headed to my cabin, which was right by reception, to drop off my bags, and then I very quickly ran around the ship to explore. There wasn't a lot going on because it was the middle of the night, but there were small signs around that this would be very different from a regular cruise. Little things like these parts on the floor so that you don't slip over when you have your snow boots on. They would definitely come in handy, and before this I'd never really seen that much snow actually on a ship, but that was all about to change. I decided to leave the exploring of the rest of the areas until the morning. I wanted my first impression to be in daylight, and I was as curious about my cabin as I was the rest of the ship. I'm not too sure what I expected from my sea view cabin on a ferry, but it definitely wasn't this. I expected it to be kind of cramped, a little bit dark. I always think of bunk beds when I think of ferries for some reason, but this was big, it was bright, it was about the same size as an ocean view cabin, probably that you'd have on a regular cruise ship. The bed looked comfy, and on it were 2 duvets. That's very standard in Norway and actually standard in a lot of Europe. We usually only have 1 in the UK, but 2 does make a lot of sense. I would be very happy for 2 to be the standard. It makes it so much easier to put the covers on, having 2 singles instead of a double. The big pile of seasickness bags was a little nerve-wracking, of course, but I decided better safe than sorry, and that I would head to bed before I could risk feeling any movement. When I woke up the next morning, I had no idea how many ports we'd already passed. Often on the big cruise ships, I'll wake up when we dock because they kind of vibrate, especially if you're at the back, but the Havila Polaris was almost entirely silent because she is partly battery powered. She's one of the most environmentally friendly ships in the world, and Havila are very much at the forefront of shipping technology. It is my hope that the other cruise lines will follow Havila's lead, but we will just have to wait and see on that one. The ship actually uses a combination of batteries and LNG fuel because that is the most efficient way. They can sail entirely on batteries for 4 hours if they need to, which is pretty incredible. Even when I was stood outside on the deck later in the cruise, I wouldn't be able to tell if we were still docked or if we'd started sailing away because it was so quiet. The big hat that I always wore might have had something to do with it, and also the snow that was constantly hitting me in the face. I actually think I got snow or wind burn on my cheeks during this cruise. Keep a look throughout this video and see if you can see me getting redder and redder as the cruise went on. We headed to the main dining room for breakfast, and it was here that we picked our dining times. Because guests can be on board for as little as an hour, the cruises don't always include food as standard. I decided to buy what is called a meal package so that all of my meals in the main dining room and the cafe were included. I had no idea what that meant in reality, but I was looking forward to finding out. I don't really eat seafood, and Norway of course is famous for it, so I was hoping that there would be some other options. We decided to pick one of the earliest time slots for dining, and that meant that our breakfast, lunch and dinner would always be at this set time. I'm not much of an early bird, so I knew that I wouldn't really get up and have breakfast at 7:30 every day, but it was worth it to get the early dinner slot of 6:30. I would pick dinner over breakfast every single day. In reality, the crew were so helpful, the ship wasn't full, so I'm sure they would have let us eat at another time if we asked. Later in the cruise, we even had a friend come on board the ship to join us for breakfast, which is definitely not something you can do on a regular cruise. He had to pay for his breakfast breakfast, of course, but still it was great. He got a little tour of the ship, and at that point it was more like a floating restaurant. When we were sat in the restaurant, I noticed that the menus were in Norwegian, English and German. I was curious about who would be on this cruise, but at this point I was just happy to have some food. We ordered with one of the waiters who was absolutely lovely, and the food came very fast. I had heard good things about the food on board, and this breakfast definitely did live up to that. I mean, look at these fancy little trays for the fruit. So fancy. After breakfast, I wandered along deck 6 to find this lovely big lounge with lots of seats. This lounge wraps right the way around the front of the ship, and there are very comfortable chairs next to pretend fires. There's no real fires on the ship, of course, unless something has gone very wrong. Speaking of things going wrong, I did notice that on the back of the doors where it explained the safety information, it said that we would have to put on survival suits in an emergency. It hadn't really crossed my mind before just how cold the water was below us. We did see massive chunks of ice in the water too, so I definitely didn't want to get anywhere near that. Most days on this cruise it was between -12, -15 Celsius, which I think is around 5 Fahrenheit if you're watching this and you're American. The ship felt very quiet, but my friend David, who I'll refer to in this video as my Norway expert, said that the cruise was busier on the way north and quieter on the way south. I took his word for that, but honestly he could have told me anything and I'd have believed it. At one point he did tell me that he saw a barn being transported by boat. I was not planning on believing that, but looking at this video, it absolutely is true. I've asked David how to pronounce almost every Norwegian word in this video, so if I say any wrong, please feel free to go and tell David. His channel is called Life in Norway, and I'll link to it below. I did notice that there were lots of sick bags around the ship. They do pop up on regular cruise ships from time to time, but on board this ship they were absolutely everywhere. In every direction there would be bags. On one hand this was reassuring, but on another slightly terrifying. I also didn't like how the bags said on them, "When filled, put on the ground." Imagine finding a bag of somebody sick. That is disgusting. Better though than somebody trying to carry it around a rocking ship. Anyway, the less we think about that, the better. Polaris is one of only 4 Havila ships, and she is the newest. She's been sailing for around 6 months, so everything was absolutely pristine on board. I really love the Scandinavian style too, and it's very different from the other ships that do sail on this route. The main competitor for Havila on this route is a cruise line called Hurtigruten, and the route that they actually sail up from Bergen to Kirkenes is actually called Hurtigruten. So Hurtigruten were the only cruise line there, and they basically said, we'll just take the name of the route. That was until the new kids on the block, Havila, showed up to give them some competition. So now Havila and Hurtigruten are both sailing here, and I like to think that they're friends. Also on deck 6 was a shop that sold lots of weird and wonderful things, including these tiny shoes that I thought that I should get for my cat Hudson. I did ask Instagram if I should, and they did back me up on it, but I don't think Hudson would appreciate it, sadly. They sell lots of practical things here too, like coats, which are definitely needed. I'm not sure who would come on a trip like this without a coat, but maybe if someone's luggage got lost or it got damaged, it's great that there are some options here. There was also a conference room where they would do daily talks, and at this point I wasn't actually sure what I would be doing on a cruise like this. There isn't a theatre, there aren't game shows or anything that I'm used to on a cruise. I'm used to roller skating and swimming, but I would find out later what the real entertainment on a cruise like this was. It was around now that we started to pull into our first port. We headed out the front of the ship and watched as we sailed into this tiny, tiny town. I don't think I've ever seen so much snow, and the way that everybody just drives around on it, I don't think I'll ever get used to. We don't get much snow in the UK. We were only in this first port for around half an hour, so I wasn't planning on getting off. I could have if I wanted to, and later in the cruise I often did run off, pretty much put my hand in the snow and then come back, but I wanted to watch this sail-in from up high, as did a lot of the other guests. At the start of this trip, I did wonder how you can really explore a place when you're only visiting it for half an hour or sometimes only 15 minutes. Havila do offer excursions that are longer, and what they'll sometimes do is the excursion guests will get off in one port and then the bus will meet the ship at a later port. I've taken river cruises like that in the past, but on the ocean this was a very novel concept. Normally on ocean cruises you only have one port or maybe 2 ports a day though. We got to see the excursions in practice a little later when we were scheduled to sail under a bridge. Somehow they managed to time it so that when we sailed under the bridge, the excursion bus was driving across. An announcement came over the tannoy and said that if we wanted to, we could go outside and we could wave our flags to the bus. I very quickly got changed into my outside clothes and I headed out to the top deck. It was freezing, of course it was freezing, and it was quite tricky to see through the wind, but it was so much fun. I met some other guests up there too, some from the US, some from the UK, and it prepared me a little bit for what it would be like to go outside later. I was so grateful for my snow boots, my hat, my coat, and my gloves during times like this. I'd often pull out my phone to film without my glove on, and in a few seconds my hand would start to sting. I have put together a guide of everything I packed on my website in case you are going on a snowy cruise, and the link to that is in the description. During my tour of the ship, I came across a cafe area that looked absolutely lovely. I personally really loved the design and the colours, everything felt fresh and new, and I decided that I would like to have my lunch here. As part of my meal package, I could have pizzas, burgers, sandwiches, stews, all kinds of good things. I first went for the burger, which was very good, and I came back later in the cruise for a pizza. We could also have the pastries here too, and the cinnamon rolls were huge and always freshly baked. We spent hours sitting here watching the scenery go by. My Norway expert David used it as his office, but it is tricky not to get distracted by views like this. The menus do have prices, and some people did pay as they went rather than buying a meal package. Norway is an expensive place to visit. I'll let you know how much this cruise cost me in a bit, but it is worth remembering that even if you were to buy something in Norway like a McDonald's, it'll probably be 50% extra than what you're used to at home, if you're from the UK anyway. I bought a pint of cider in Norway once and it cost me £12, and that's $15, which is another good reason why it's good to cruise in Norway. The pizza on the menu was around £14, which is very good for Norway. If I hadn't paid for my meals, I could have bought on board my own food from the ports. I did bring my favourite drink, Pepsi Max, and I stocked my fridge with it. It is a ferry after all, and being able to bring anything on board was a massive perk. After lunch, we went outside after, of course, getting on all of our snowy clothes. We had to scan our cruise card in the same way you would on a big cruise ship, and after that, we were free to explore. We just walked down the ramp and straight into the port. We had port stops up to 2 hours on this cruise, and we did get a chance to explore quite a few different places. Some were easier to get around than others because of the snow. Fresh snow is relatively easy to walk on, but when it becomes icy and slushy, it can be very slippery. When it was icy, I would wear these spikes on my shoes, and when I had the spikes on, I was pretty much as good as walking as the locals without spikes. It made me a local, but I had to have spikes. The port that we visited was called Stokmarknes, and I found the most impressive icicles here. After about an hour or so of walking, I was ready to get back on the ship, which was good because these ships absolutely do not wait. They have a busy schedule and they will wait for no person. The good thing, I suppose, is if you did miss the ship, you could get to a later port if you needed to board again. It would be very expensive and stressful, and I wouldn't want to be racing the ship in a taxi, especially on those snowy roads. Right at the top of the ship, I found a big lounge that I called the Observation Lounge. That wasn't its name, but it would be if it was on a cruise ship, and I just couldn't help calling it that. The lounge was massive, beautifully decorated, and there were so many seats. Even when we were sailing in and out of ports, I could have had 20 seats here to myself if I wanted to. There was also glass in the ceiling, which would have been incredible if the Northern Lights did come out to play. They didn't for me on my cruise, but earlier in this cruise, David did get to see them. It's in a lounge like this that you would find the entertainment on a regular cruise, but the entertainment that we had was slightly different. Instead of watching a comedian, we had hours and hours of scenery like this. I did see one other guest out here in shorts, which I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me for a minute, because it was around 12 Celsius, which is about 10 Fahrenheit, I think. Sailing through the Rafsund was incredible. It is this area that big cruise ships could never get to, and the ship was silent. It was so silent. Next on my to-do list was dinner. I knew that we had another port stop this evening and I wanted to explore, so I needed fuel for that. We went to our assigned table and the menu was explained to us. The menu changes every 3 or 4 days, which is different to a regular cruise ship where it changes every day, but that was plenty. The food was fantastic and the service was really fast. It looked to me like this area had originally been set up to be a buffet. I'm not sure if it was, but to minimise food waste, all of the food was served to you. Even at lunch, they serve you a combination of small dishes. Perhaps they changed their mind on that, but whatever it was, it made the service very fast. I had a ratatouille and a panna cotta all washed down with a Pepsi Max in a very fancy glass. Drinks aren't included in the meal plan, but they do have a drinks package of sorts that you can buy. It's more like buying a certain number of drink tokens for a discount rather than the usual unlimited package. Apparently, the people of Norway drink more Pepsi Max than any other country. I would like to personally challenge them on that because I think I could outdrink anybody for Pepsi Max. It is my favourite drink. We ate in our normal cold weather clothes and that was absolutely fine. There weren't any dress codes, although I did decide to put a dress on the next day. This day though, I knew I was going back outside in the evening. I really didn't miss the traditional entertainment because my trip was organised so much around the meals and the port stops. Wandering off in the dark in Norway was so much fun. You very rarely get late night stops on regular cruises, but sometimes we would have a port at midnight or 3 AM, literally any time. The ship works around the clock, always loading supplies and people and I don't know what else. When we woke up, we decided to head outside and I was amazed by the snow on the decks. We did have a little bit on the first day, but we had been quite lucky with the weather. On this day though, there were massive piles of snow everywhere and even our cat mascot, Captain Hudson, had to help clear the decks. They had these little machines that would basically fire the snow overboard, which was very cool. They did tell us ahead of time that they would be getting the snow off the ship, and I had visions of the ship going through some sort of car wash with rollers on the side and it would be shaking the ship. It wasn't anything like that though, and I'm sure the wind does blow a lot of the snow off. You'd think that all of this snow would weigh down the ship, but this is very normal in Norway in winter. There was far more outside space than I expected from this ship. I would think that these areas would be used a lot more in summer, but I did see one person using one of the hot tubs. There was also a little sauna, and further down in the ship there were 2 small gyms, one for cardio and the other one for whatever other things people like to do in the gym. I was a little nervous about the weather because we were planning to sail out into the open sea more than we had before, but I had packed lots of seasickness remedies. I had the tablets, I had the wristband, I had the weird wristband that electric shocks me, and best of all, I had ginger biscuits that I'd bought from back home in the UK. The weather was still calm at this point, but as soon as the ship rocked slightly, I would use that as an excuse to eat ginger biscuits. Ginger is great for seasickness, and I just love them. The atmosphere around the ship as we headed into our next port was very relaxed. People were doing puzzles, catching up with work, chatting with friends, and we had a chance to get to know the crew. They were kind enough to let me have a look in an inside cabin and an accessible inside cabin, which was very interesting. The inside cabins are usually used by people who were only on board for a few days, and there are big suites on board too with balconies. I can't imagine waking up and seeing snow on your balcony, but that must be very cool. I was very happy with my choice of sea view cabin though. Our location was right in the middle of the ship and we saw some amazing things from the window. Heading out in Brønnøysund was very different to the ports before. The snow was coming down sideways, it was sticking to my eyelashes. I decided that this would be the perfect time to do a snow angel, and the snow was actually lovely and fluffy. It felt like icing sugar. Very, very cold icing sugar, of course. My friend and Norway expert David went to a local shop and the rest of us just tried to work out what was road and what was the path. There were zebra crossings under there somewhere, but we really couldn't see them. Luckily for us though, the people of Norway were so friendly and so polite, and they would always let us cross the road. It must be quite weird for them to see all of these tourists just bumbling around. Your Britishism of the week is zebra crossing. I'm pretty sure they're just called crossings or crosswalks in other countries, but this is definitely a zebra crossing. We also have puffin crossings, pelican crossings, and lollipop ladies who look after them, but that is a Britishism for another video. After getting wet in the snow, I went back to my cabin to change into a dress for the evening. The temperature in the ship was actually very warm, and it's weird to think that my house in the UK feels colder than the ship did here, but it is absolutely true. I was perfectly warm in just this dress, but of course it did mean that I couldn't just pop outside or I would freeze. In the evening, one of the ladies who worked on board sang for us in the big lounge, and this was the first time I'd ever really seen a lot of people together at once. It was getting a little rocky, but I had taken my seasickness medicine, so I wasn't too worried. I didn't at any point on this cruise see anybody be sick or look unwell. I think we got very lucky with our weather given the time of year. Everybody who had been on that northbound trip told me about the rocky seas. They had to cancel a lot of ports because of storms, and I'm so glad I picked the southbound part of the journey because I almost didn't. I was debating which one to pick. I was on the cruise for 4 days and the cruise cost me £791, which is $993 US. Considering that the cruise was in Norway, which is very expensive, and that price was for a sea view cabin including food, I don't think that is too bad. That price is based on 2 sharing a cabin, so we both paid that price. I did of course have to add on a flight to Tromso, a night in a hotel there, and a flight back from Bergen, which almost cost me as much as the cruise, but it was absolutely worth it. It's a shame we didn't get to see the Northern Lights this time, but I did see them last year on a more traditional Norwegian cruise. To find out what that was like and how it was different, very, very different from this Norwegian ferry, check out this video next.